Maybe I read too many comics as a kid. In the comics, it always seems like they're trying to save the world. It seems like one should try to make the world a better place because the inverse makes no sense. It is now 1970 in the South African city of Pretoria. The 22-year-old May Heldenman gets married to Elon Musk. Exactly 9 months and 2 days after the wedding, the couple welcomes a new member of the family, a handsome baby boy, which they named Elon Musk. At times, the young Elon would become completely unresponsive when someone spoke to him. He would drift off into this trance-like state with a distant look in his eyes. The doctors and his parents were naturally terrified by this, by the possibility that their precious little boy was deaf. The doctors then took it upon themselves to take the boy into surgery, removing his adenoid glands, since this procedure is known to improve hearing in children. Unfortunately and surprisingly, this did not solve the problem. See, Elon's behavior was not a result of poor hearing functionality. As it turned out, he was so deep in his thoughts that almost all his mental resources were used for thinking, leaving little to none for hearing. This is what he, in his own words, had to say about this. It seems as though the part of the brain that's usually reserved for visual processing, the part that is used to process images coming in from my eyes, gets taken over by internal thought processes. When he was not lost in his head, Elon was lost in the mall. Unfortunately, there were no medals for anyone who could correctly guess where he was, for Elon was always in the nearest bookstore. Elon read so much as a child that, according to his brother, he would burn through 2 books per day on weekends. When Elon was about 9 years of age, difficulties came knocking on the Musk household. With his parents now separated and divorced, Elon went to live with his mother in their Durban holiday home. After a few years under this arrangement, Elon felt that it was unfair that he and 2 of his younger siblings all lived with their mother, and so decided to move back to Pretoria to stay with his father. Elon's father worked as a mechanical and electrical engineer and ran a very successful engineering business. Elon describes him as a very talented engineer who knew how every physical object worked. He would require both Elon and his younger brother Kimball to go to site with him, where he would teach them bricklaying, plumbing, fitting windows, and electrical wiring. When he was 10 years old, Elon stumbled upon a computer for the very first time at the Sandton City Mall in Johannesburg. He immediately knew that he had to own the machine, and exercising one of the classic behaviors that would later become part of who Elon Musk is, he relentlessly annoyed his father until he finally gave in and bought him the Commodore VIC-20. But this was not an impulsive, flashy purchase for Elon. Instead, Elon went to work on the computer with jaw-dropping obsession. See, the computer came with a workbook with lessons on how to program it. If you were not Elon, you were supposed to complete in half a year. Listen to how Elon did it. It was supposed to take like 6 months to get through all the lessons, Elon said. I just got super OCD on it and stayed up for 3 days with no sleep and did the entire thing. It seemed like the most super compelling thing I'd ever seen. It should not be surprising then that by 13 years of age, Elon had created his first computer game, which he called Blaster, which he then sold, walking away from the transaction with $500 US. Unfortunately, but according to him, fortunately, Elon's childhood was not at all rosy. Living with his father came with a lot of perks, such as overseas trips, engineering experience, and computer purchases. But there was a really dark side to the picture. Elon has made it very clear that his father made his childhood really challenging, but has refused to provide details. When pressed for more information, Elon responded by saying, "It would certainly be accurate to say that I did not have a good childhood. It may sound good, it was not absent of good, but it was not a happy childhood. It was like misery. He's good at making life miserable, that's for sure. He can take any situation, no matter how good it is, and make it bad. He's not a happy man. I don't know. I don't know how someone becomes like he is. It will just cause too much trouble to tell you anymore." At school, life was not easy either. Elon had fallen into the hands of a gang of bullies. One of the bullying incidents got so intense and violent that it left Elon hospitalized for about a week. Elon has opened up about doing a nose job to cover up the lingering effects of that incident. On 9 June 1967, a Defense Amendment Bill was passed. This bill made it necessary for white men in South Africa to serve in the army. Men between the ages of 17 and 65 were required to serve for 9 months. When Musk was 1 year old, in 1972, the military service period had increased to 1 year. When he was 6 years old, in 1977, it had increased to 2 years. But there was a problem. Probably not wanting to get his ass kicked by Mkhonto Wesizwe, Musk decided he was not the type of guy to join the army. Instead, he wanted to chase the American dream. But that presented another problem. Getting to America was not going to be easy. But Musk had a plan. See, Elon's mother was born in Canada in 1948. But then her father decided to move to South Africa when she was only 2 years old. This meant that technically she was Canadian. And while Musk was planning his escape from South Africa, a change in law happened coincidentally, which allowed Musk's mother to transfer her Canadian citizenship to her children. This was Elon's ticket to America. So in June 1988, after attending classes for only 5 months at the University of Pretoria, the 17-year-old Musk landed in Canada. Musk spent the next year working a series of odd jobs in Canada before enrolling at Queen's University. One of the girls that Musk had met during this time recalls a conversation where Musk told her that he wished there was a way to get nutrients into the body without having to sit down for a meal so that he could work more. Justin Wilson, who was another girl that Musk had met and dated at Queen's and who would later become his wife and ex-wife, recalls that she felt like they were always competing. After an exam that they'd both written, they compared grades, Justin scoring a 97 and Musk a 98. Unsatisfied by this, Musk went back to the professor and managed to convince him to give him the last 2 points that he had missed. In 1992, Musk moved to the University of Pennsylvania. This is where he started thinking about and writing about the ideas that would later shape his and probably our own future. For one of his classes, he wrote a paper titled The Importance of Being Solar, which he concluded with a drawing of the power station of the future. It articulated a pair of 4-kilometer solar arrays in space, sending energy down to Earth via microwave beams to a 7-kilometer diameter receiving antenna. On another paper, he delved into the idea of ultracapacitors, which are energy storage capacitors a few steps ahead of batteries and fuel cells. It's now 2 years down the line in 1994. Musk and his brother Kimball went for a road trip, taking turns driving and brainstorming about what startup company they could pull off. This was 1994, and so the internet was in its infancy. They came up with an idea of an online platform where doctors can collaborate and exchange information. Kimball then went to work to put together a business plan, but that didn't fly since they realized that they didn't love it. During this very same time, Musk held internships with 2 tech startups in Silicon Valley. During the day, he would work at Pinnacle Research Institute, which dealt with ultracapacitors, one of the ideas Musk was interested in during this very same time. In the afternoon, he would knock off and then head off to the second internship at the video gaming startup called Rocket Science Games. Interestingly, Tony Fadell, who would later become a major force in the development of the iPod and the iPhone at Apple, also worked at Rocket Science Games during this time. It's also interesting that over 10 years later, between 2007 and 2008, Musk tried recruiting Tony Fadell to come work for Tesla. He even went as far as throwing a surprise party for him. However, Steve Jobs heard about this and turned up the volume in his charm and kept Fadell at Apple. While on one of these internships, Elon Musk stumbled upon the idea of listing businesses with their names, contact details, and locations on an online platform. Musk, like many other people associated with Silicon Valley at the time, knew that the internet was about to go big. So convinced was Musk about this idea that 2 days into his physics doctorate at Stanford, Musk dropped out and convinced his brother to move to Silicon Valley to found their very first company, which would later become known as Zip2. Hey, you just reached the end of this video, which means that you've got a better attention span than you thought. So if you enjoyed this video, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time. Peace!